Good afternoon. My name is Marlis Amundsen, and I am the Director of Development for the College of Science at the OSU Foundation. I am pleased to welcome you for today's talk on the art of resilience, the science of songbirds, with Dr. Jamie Cornelius. This is the first in our new series, Knowledge Breaks, Behind the Scenes with Beavers. In this series, we're going into the field and into the lab, rolling up our sleeves to learn more about the natural world. At the end of our time together, I'll share more details on this series and other events. Please feel free to submit your questions during today's webcast. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button, and you're welcome to type questions throughout the talk. At the end of our presentation, our speakers will answer as many as they can before we run out of time. The OSU Foundation and the OSU Alumni Association are proud to partner with the university on this series. I am especially pleased that we're starting in the College of Science, where our faculty are dedicated to ensuring that all OSU students receive the best possible grounding in science and mathematics. Our scientists and our students are driven to understand how life and the universe work, and they are committed to applying their research to address some of the toughest challenges facing humanity. We have much to celebrate in the college. World-renowned marine scientist and OSU Distinguished Professor Jane Lubchenco was appointed by the White House earlier this year as the Deputy Director for Climate and the Environment. Exploring another way to share scientific knowledge, one of our doctoral students was honored in Science Magazine's Dance Your PhD contest. Heather is the first winner of a new category focused on COVID-19 research. We're proud of the work happening throughout OSU to make a healthy, more sustainable, equitable, and prosperous future for all of Oregon and the world. It is donors, alumni, volunteers, and friends of OSU, like you, who make this work possible. Thank you for all that you do for OSU and for our students. We are especially inspired by the resilience of that our students have demonstrated this last year. On Damn Proud Day, we're inviting the OSU community to help them stay on track with their education. We hope that the many different opportunities across campus will inspire you to give to an area that's meaningful to you. We'll also have some really fun opportunities to connect, including a TikTok challenge and a virtual photo booth. When beavers work together, we can accomplish amazing things. And I hope that you'll join us on Damn Proud Day, April 28th, a week from this Wednesday, to help our students and our faculty do even more. Our speaker today, Dr. Jamie Cornelius, is an assistant professor in the Department of Integrative Biology. She earned her doctorate at UC Davis and spent time in Russia as a Fulbright scholar. Dr. Cornelius arrived at OSU from Eastern Michigan University just as the pandemic was changing all of our lives last spring. But her previous online teaching experience helped her make a quick transition to remote education at OSU. Today, we'll get to see footage of Jamie and some of her team out in the field with the birds they are studying. Jalen Devereaux, who will serve as our moderator, is a PhD student in Jamie's lab. She came to OSU with a bachelor's in environmental science from Ohio Dominican University. Jalen was inspired by an undergraduate ornithology class, which sparked her interest in the study of birds. Today, in addition to her research, she is mentoring undergraduate students, serving as graduate advisor to the Bird Nerds Club on campus. Jalen, would you like to get us started?
Yeah, thanks, Marlis. All righty. Oh, sorry about that. Don't want that on my screen. Get out of here. Love Zoom. All righty. Well, as Marlis said, my name is Jalen Devereaux, and I hail from Ohio, where I found a passion for birds. This bird and this picture was actually taken on the West Coast, but still shows my love for birds. So when I fell in love with birds, I always knew I wanted a PhD. So I decided to start pursuing PhD positions that were involved with birds. and I found Dr. Jamie Cornelius. She happened to find a job in Oregon, so she asked if I wanted to join, and I hopped in my car and I drove out west. And here I am in Oregon studying red crossbills. And as you were going to talk about today when we get to Jamie, we are studying crossbills and unpredictable climate and how that affects the birds, especially at the metabolic level. So that's what I'm doing here at OSU. I'm a second-year PhD student, and this is our bird, the red crossbill. I also advise the undergraduate club, the Bird Nerds. So I'm here on behalf of the Bird Nerds as well as Jamie today. So what are the Bird Nerds, if you don't know? The Bird Nerds are an undergraduate club that's also involved with the OSU community and the community of Corvallis. And we come together and we go birding. We like to just nerd out on bird things, learn more about birds at the scientific level. We bring in Chimtimney Wildlife Refuge sometimes to give talks on raptors, and they bring in birds. So it's really just a community of people that are passionate about birds. And that's gotten to be very difficult when we're remote through coronavirus. So this past year, one of the cool things that we've been able to do is have a seminar series where we brought in folks from all of these institutions to come in almost weekly during the winter term and give a 30-ish minute talk about what they do when it comes to birds. And that could be research. We had a bird artist. We had someone that rehabilitates birds. So we had really interesting talks from a diverse group of people to educate our undergraduates on what kind of possibilities there are in careers with birds. So we also had some fundraising that we did during this term, and being remote, it's pretty remarkable that we fundraised over $1,400 in one day. Every spring, the Bird Nerds do what's called the Birdathon, where students go out and they try to identify as many species as possible, and then folks can bid how much money they will pledge per bird. And so this year we raised a lot of money, which is really exciting when we're in this remote setting. So Bird Nerds is doing some pretty cool things. All right, so hopefully you all like birds. So we're gonna do some bird trivia to get you excited to hear about Jamie's talk today. So let's play trivia. There are gonna be a couple polls that you can play with here. So first, I wanna ask you if you know what the state bird of Oregon is. I have some music, but I don't know if it's playing. There we go. That's probably enough time. All righty, so the state bird of Oregon is the western meadowlark. Oh, and it looks like 76% of folks here knew that, so that's awesome. Way to go. All righty, the next one here. This is, kind of up to your own discretion, but which bird here looks like its dinosaur ancestor the most? That's the end of my song. I'm just gonna cut it off there. Stop it. All right, we agree here that it's gonna be the shoebill stork, but it looks like other people would say the cassowary. Yeah, up to your own discretion. All righty. True or false? According to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, keeping feathers of native birds is illegal without a permit. That's the end of, I cut off that stuff. Okay. All right, this is true. You cannot keep feathers of native birds unless they are game birds. So you can have things like turkey feathers, but if you find something like a Steller's jay feather on the ground, you cannot have. All right. On to the next one. Okay, which of the following woodpeckers is not found in the state of Oregon? All right. So the answer is the yellow-bellied sapsucker because it hails from the east side of the country where I'm from. So we do not have the yellow-bellied sapsucker here in Oregon. All righty. All right. What does flock stand for? This is a club at OSU as well. All right. Sorry. The answer is the Field and Lab Ornithology Collaboratory. This is a collaboration of people taking students into the field to learn about, to learn about birds. So yeah, most people got that right. That's awesome. You might see their stickers. They have varied thrush stickers on and everything. All right. What is the most common backyard bird in Oregon according to eBird? All right. It is the American robin. Wow, that was really close results across the board. I actually think the goldfinch may have been one of the second up there. So yeah, there's an interesting switch around here, but all these birds are very common, but it is the American robin. Alrighty. Which bird is invasive to Oregon? All right. The answer is the barred owl. Oh, and again, most people got that right. So house finches are fine here. The house sparrow is invasive, so that may be what you're thinking of for those 29% of folks there. But yeah, it is the barred owl taking over the habitat of spotted owls. Alrighty. So which type of wren did the Pacific wren and Eurasian wren recently branch out from? All right. The winter wren. Woo, that was really close. The Buick's wren, I believe, is the most common wren in the state of Oregon, but the winter wren is actually the one on the east side. And they recently realized that this western, very similar species of wren is a different species, and that's the Pacific wren. So it's from the winter wren. All right. So what cute seabird is shown that everyone in the state of Oregon seems to be obsessed with? All right. It is the marbled murrelet, and it seems like you all might be obsessed with it too. 73% knew exactly which one this was. So, marbled murrelet. All right. What bird mimics a snake when it's threatened at the nest? All righty. Let's see. It is the wryneck. Whoa! And a lot of people put roadrunner. I wondered if that would trip people up because they're so in the same area as like rattlesnakes. But it is the wryneck, and I have a nice little video to show you how it actually moves. It's a quick little one. Maybe will it let me do it? So it does imitate snakes if the internet works. Wait for it. There's no sound to this video, but that is the wryneck. Lovely. Not the roadrunner. Alrighty, let's move on. All right, so what bird flies across the entire globe twice during migration? All right. Again, everybody knows this one, the Arctic tern. 78% of people got that right. I do believe some hummingbirds do go quite far, but it is not Anna's hummingbird. It is the Arctic tern. All right. What bird is of great interest at Oregon State between both birders and foresters? Alrighty. It is the spotted owl. It should be the red crossbill because it's by far the coolest. And the ivory-billed woodpecker is unfortunately extinct. So it is the spotted owl. Barred owl would be semi of interest because it's taking over spotted owl territory, but it's the spotted owl. All right, true or false? The red crossbill is the coolest bird of all time. I mean, look at it. This is a great segue. No, it is true, or not just true, people. This is a great segue into our talk here, but the red crossbill is more than true of the coolest bird of all time. It's truer than true. The red crossbill is the coolest bird of all time. So I'm going to pass it on to my advisor, Dr. Jamie Cornelius, to tell you about some of the work that we're going to be doing with red crossbills in the next couple of years. So thanks.
Thanks, Jalen. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. It's always a little bit hard to not see your faces at these events, but we appreciate you tuning in and learning more about what we're doing in our lab. So I want to thank first, the type of work I do involves a lot of different places and a lot of different people. And so I always like first to start with just thanking all of those people who have helped to launch my career and to do all of this research. So, I do work across the entire West. So many different states give me permits in order to work with these birds, and many different private landowners and people have helped to give me access to places to do this field work, which is centrally important. And I also do think it's important to acknowledge too that all of this work that's taken place across the entire west of the United States is of course prior Native American land. So I just want to acknowledge that that land was forcibly taken. And I am now, enjoying the use of many of those public spaces, and I think it's really important to keep that in mind. I also want to thank, before we start, my advisor, Tom Hahn, who I've continued to work with. He's at UC Davis, and he was, of course, central in getting me to where I am today and having a successful career. And then finally, my husband, Taylor Chappell, who's also a faculty here at OSU. He's a marine biologist, studies sharks. And he has been, 100% behind me the whole way. So you'll get some glimpse of that today. But obviously, the most fun thing to do would be to take you all in the field, and see these birds live. But not being able to do that and not being able to be together in a room for this event, we've settled on the next best thing. And I want to thank Sarah and Marlis and Brendan for putting together this event, and Brendan for putting together this video. So he gave me a camera and I took it in the field. And we got a lot of footage, and Brendan has woven together a story for you to watch today about my research, and afterwards we can spend a few minutes answering questions. So feel free to put those in the Q&A, and Brendan, you can go ahead and start the video. Hi, my name is Jamie Cornelius, and I am an ecophysiologist in the Integrative Biology Department at Oregon State University. The big question that my lab is interested in is, how do animals cope with changes in the environment that are not predictable? We know that animals are quite good at dealing with predictable changes, like when birds migrate or mammals hibernate to survive, cold winters. But changes that are unpredictable, things like storms, fires, droughts, extreme weather events, these can be harder for animals to cope with, and they can lead to mass mortality events. And unfortunately, with climate change, we're seeing more and more of these events, and most climate models predict that these are going to increase in intensity and frequency. And so my lab is interested in understanding, how do animals cope with unpredictable events, and what might allow them to persist in the face of climate change? The main study system that I use to answer these questions is the red crossbill. They're a small finch, and they're well named for their special bill morphology, which people sometimes think is an injury when they see them at their feeders, but it's not. It's a specialized morphology that allows them to pry apart the scales of conifer cones so that they can access the seeds inside. This makes them a very good study system for us because the cones retain their seeds for sometimes as much as a year, maybe more, and they remain accessible even in the winter, because when the snow falls, it doesn't completely cover the cones, and so crossbills have access to this food supply year-round. One of the coolest things about crossbills is that they are north temperate residents, so they live here when it's beautiful in the summer and when it's beautiful in the winter, but very different, and with very different challenges. And that means that they can remain in very cold places in the north temperate zone through the winter. And in fact, they're so good at getting the seeds out of these cones, so efficient, that they're actually capable of raising young in the dead of winter as well as in the summer. So here's two ponderosa pine cones, and obviously one of them is quite a bit older and also has been foraged on, not by a crossbill, but by a squirrel, which is the red crossbill's kind of main seed competitor. Crossbills don't actually destroy the cone like this. They pry apart the scales in order to get the seed. So here's a bird that lives year-round in the north temperate zone. It's exposed to warm summers, it's exposed to cold winters, and it can breed in either of those scenarios, but sometimes it doesn't, and so they're sometimes just surviving. So what we can do then is ask, how much energy does it take the birds to do these different things in different seasons, and how impactful are storms on these birds in different seasons and when they're doing different things, like trying to raise young or just trying to survive as an adult. To study these questions, we use controlled experiments in the lab, but if you want to study ecophysiology, you really have to get out there in the field and study the animals in their natural environment. So we do field work, and the first step is finding and catching crossbills, which is not as easy as it may sound because crossbills are nomadic. They move across the continent looking for conifer seed crops. But once we find them, then we try to catch them, and again, not as easy as it sounds because crossbills like to be at the tops of trees where the cones are. So we look for a place where we can bring them down, usually a water source, grit or salt source. And then we set up mist nets, and these are very fine nets that are strung between two net poles. And then we use live birds as decoys, effectively pet birds, that call to the wild ones and bring their attention to the resource on the ground so that we have a chance of catching them. The main questions that we're trying to answer are, how expensive is it for these birds to survive in these difficult conditions, and what are the behaviors that they use to survive these difficult conditions? And so we need to be able to follow the birds in order to understand their behavior, and we need a way to measure their energy, and that is a difficult thing to do in the field, but there's an amazing technology using heart rate radio telemetry where we can fix these onto the backs of the birds, and it can detect their heart rate. And then we have the difficult job of trying to follow the bird for 48 hours while it's wearing these heart rate monitor so that we can record it and learn something about how expensive it is energy-wise to live in these different conditions. So now we have a heart rate transmitter on this bird. You can see the antenna coming out alongside the tail feathers. And this transmitter is going to allow us to follow the bird. And we'll make a recording of the signal that's coming off of him. And with that signal, we'll be able to filter the files later and detect and measure his heart rate in real time while he's being a bird out in the wild. And this whole unit will just fall off in about a week. So now we have a bird that's wearing a radio transmitter, and that transmitter is sending out a signal that's a particular frequency. And we need to be able to listen to that and to follow it. And so we've got our antenna and our receiver that's tuned to the particular frequency we're using. And that's connected to an MP3 recorder that's recording the signal so that we can filter it and get the heart rate information out of the signal. When we're tracking a bird, there's different challenges in different seasons. In the summer, it's nice and warm, but the days are really long, which can be really exhausting. In the winter, you have nice short days, but you're sometimes trudging through very deep snow on snowshoes after a flying bird. And you can imagine that it's not a very fair race. And then we have similar differences in the different habitats. In the high elevation, dry, cold, pine forests, it's a lot easier to get through the understory. There effectively isn't much of an understory. And on the coastal forests, you have a really thick understory that's really hard to get an antenna to move through, and your body as well. Crossbills forage at the top of trees, and that's both challenging in that you have to have a pretty decent pair of binoculars or a scope in order to watch them do this. But it's also convenient in the sense that they're up in the sky is the background, and every time they eat a seed, they spit out the seed whole. And you can actually see this happen, and you can count how many seeds the bird is eating per minute of handling the cone. And this can give us a really good estimate of how hard it is for them to get food. That's a really hard thing to measure in a bird, but you can do it in a crossbill. A few years ago, we were tracking an adult male in the Grand Tetons, and a big winter storm rolled in. And on the first day, it was really snowy, really windy, it was cold. And then the next day that we were tracking him, the temperature warmed up just a little bit. And it was enough so that the snow turned into rain. So it was a howling, windy, rainy day. It was awful, super cold. And we were measuring the heart rate or recording the heart rate of the bird the whole time. And later, when we got back to the lab and filtered the signal, we saw that there was an enormous increase in the heart rate of this bird, suggesting that rain, especially cold rain, was significantly more expensive for the birds to cope with. And this got us thinking about the impacts of climate change. If we're going to have slightly warmer winters, then we might have more rain on average than we have in the past. How will that impact birds that are trying to survive in the winter? How will it impact crossbills who are trying to raise young in the winter? We've also noticed that crossbills that live on the coast don't seem to breed as frequently in the winter as crossbills that live in really cold places where there's oftentimes snow. And we're wondering if perhaps the rain, this is more evidence that rain is costly. And so one of the ways that we want to measure this and test it is to study crossbills who are wintering in one of the rainiest, temperate winters we could think of, the Olympic National Park. Crossbills also don't seem to breed as frequently when they're found in coastal forests, which are characterized by these very wet, rainy winters. And so we're curious if this might be because of the challenges that animals face when it's cold and when it's rainy. So to answer this question or this hypothesis, we're going to go and try to track crossbills in Olympic National Park, which is going to be a huge challenge, but what a great place to learn more about the impacts of cold winter rain than in the Pacific Northwest rainforests. In the end, we hope that we can learn something more about how these resilient little songbirds survive under such challenging conditions, and not only survive, but raise young. And in doing that, we hope to be able to predict how both crossbills and other species might be impacted by the effects of a warming winter. Well, thanks, Brendan, for showing that. And I think now we're happy to take questions. And I believe Jalen might be reading those off, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, we have a couple. I might answer a couple that were about bird nerds first, if that's okay.
Sure.
So first, somebody asked how they can join the bird nerds, and then somebody also asked if faculty and staff could join, and yes to both. So I'm going to chat the bird nerds website, and you can go on there and you can actually ask to be a member that way. And then if not, feel free to email me personally. I can put my email in there as well and get you on our list. So let me chat that to all people. So that's our website. And then I'll also type in my email just so you have that if you would like. So there is those two things. And then first you have not a question, but a comment from, I think, a previous student, Jacqueline Drake. Says, makes me feel like I'm back in research again watching this. Miss you, Dr. C. So that might be somebody from Michigan. Yeah, thank you, Jacqueline. So the first question I have here is from Rich, and it's how much of a survival challenge does a short-term weather event, such as the storm event that happened in February, present for birds, and maybe even just in our crossbills?
Yeah, so those ice storms are probably particularly challenging because they cover up, access to seeds on the ground, which most, kind of north temperate winter residents are relying pretty heavily for songbirds on seed supplies. And some birds store those seeds and others forage for them. And when there's wide scale coverage by ice, that's particularly challenging. And songbirds have a very high metabolic rate, and that means that they work all day to eat as much food as they can to store enough fat to burn overnight when it's dark and they can't forage, and survive until the morning. And so for them, more than one day without food is probably going to be fatal, especially if it's also cold out. So I think those events can be really high mortality events for the winter residents. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Another question we have is from Joshua, and it's, are the birds aware that they're being followed by you on snowshoes or by snowshoeless humans?
Yeah, there are definitely many species that would be aware and would change their behavior. We're lucky in the fact that crossbills live, really high in the canopy at the tops of trees, and they just seem completely unworried about humans. And I would actually extend that to be a lot of potential predators that are ground predators. They're just not, they don't, we can catch them. There are days when I'm catching crossbills and they are an intensely social species. And we think that actually is one adaptation that helps them to cope with the unpredictable food supply that they are specialized on. They pay attention to other birds, very well. And that's one reason why we can attract them to the ground with decoys, live decoys. They want to see what those other crossbills have because they're oftentimes looking for food. So there are times when I'm trying to measure something that takes a little bit of time in the birds, maybe hormones that elevate when they're captured by a net. And so I only want to catch 1 or 2 birds at a time, but there are times when entire flocks of crossbills are bombing the nets, and I'm just kind of waving my arms trying to get them to go away, and they're going into the net like under my arms as I'm waving them in the air. So they show this kind of behavior frequently. They're quite bold. And so I don't think that us, running around on the ground following them is probably changing their behavior much. I can't say that, definitively, of course. I'm not a crossbill. But I think that they're one of the species where this probably matters very little for.
We have a question that's a really good observation. I'm very impressed, from Marilyn. And she asks, what is the benefit of fireplace ashes for crossbills? I've seen this feeding behavior in both Doug fir and ponderosa pine campgrounds.
That is a very astute observation, and it's actually one of the ways that we catch them by putting our nets around existing campfire sites. And what we think is that they're actually consuming ash in order to help clean the digestive tract of resins from foraging on conifer cones. So, you'll find them and they have pitch all over their bills, and no doubt that a fair bit of that goes into the digestive tract. And so just like people can be treated with ash and charcoal treatments to cleanse the system, we think that crossbills do the same thing.
We have another question. Are the bills crossed when they hatch?
They are not. And actually a fair bit of research has gone into trying to understand how how the bills cross. And it's still not well known, I would say. There's different theories out there. But recently I was contacted by a person who does wildlife rehab, and she had some interesting observations where she thinks that there's this period of very fast growth, and the birds actually, physically push their bills in one direction or the other. Obviously, you'd have to do some controlled experiments to know for sure, but I find it a really intriguing possibility that it would still be, probably genetically controlled behavior to do that in the first place. But I find it really interesting to think about that there could be kind of this period of really fast growth when the bill starts growing, and that it requires a behavior in order to assist the bill to grow in that particular pattern.
We have another question. Oh, did you have more? Sorry.
Yeah, I just realized, it's having followed these birds and watched them a lot, it's fun to watch the juveniles learn how to use that bill. It's not easy, and they're terrible at it at first. They drop cones, they're really clumsy. They're really slow, they don't get seeds out very fast. And juveniles are still growing, and so, they really need a high seed intake rate. And so their parents will feed them for the first month to 2 months out of the nests, and that's fairly rare in the bird world.
Okay. So Zek asks, are rainier winters likely to increase the cone crop available for crossbills, and how might whatever the changes in cone crop from rainier winters affect crossbill fitness?
That's a good question, and there are some labs who have studied what are the climate conditions that induce conifers to produce cones. So many conifer species produce cones in what are called masting crops, where a huge geographic region will see a really big boom cone crop. And this is why crossbills are nomadic. They show up in these regions with really big cone crops and use them until the cones drop their seeds. There are some weather patterns that can predict that. A wet winter followed by a dry spring can be an inducing cue. And so it's possible that climate change certainly could impact cone crop frequency and quality, but I don't think it's super well known yet which direction that's going to go. But you can imagine for these birds that are nomadic and trying to find cone crops, if there's a disruption in kind of the normal patterning across the entire continent on a continent-wide scale, you can have really serious repercussions for birds that need to find those crops if it changes how frequently and where these cone crops develop. But it's a big mystery how they find them, if somebody's about to ask that. They're really good at it, but certainly there's probably high mortality during those movements to find them. And we're getting really close to being able to track those movements with satellite tags, but they're not quite small enough. But we hope to in the next 5 years or so.
Yeah. I do wonder, and this is more of a speculation than anything because I'm not a weather person, but if like increases in like a rainier winter would also increase wind, and if that would affect seeds being in the cones or if it's pulling them out prior to normal, or like being better pushing seeds out.
Yes, wind certainly is a big factor in dispersing the seeds, and once the seeds are out of the cones, crossbills can't use them anymore. So yeah, what you see usually is that there's a huge seed availability in the cones until the fall. And then the dry, windy weather causes a lot of the seeds to disperse. And so crossbills may or may not be able to stay and breed in the winter. And that's where kind of this unpredictability in food comes into play for them.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into a question from Lucas. He asks what the crossbills supplement their diet with if there is no seed availability.
Yeah, so a lot of people think that crossbills are really strict specialists, that they never eat anything other than conifer seeds. And from my own work, I know that's definitely not the case because I have tracked individual crossbills that have never once in 48 hours of tracking gone into a conifer. So there are times when they eat lots of insects, and they're certainly opportunists. There's also really cool observations over the years of crossbills using really weird things, like boring into the middle of apples to get the seeds out. And they would probably only be doing those behaviors if it was really bad and there weren't seeds inside cones that they could find. They certainly mostly eat conifer seeds, but they do supplement with, if there's big juicy insects to be had, they will eat them.
Another person, along with food, I guess, Charlotte is asking, have bird feeders affected the survival of crossbills?
Crossbills they do frequently visit feeders, but not as much as other species. And I think partially it's because they're so specialized, that it takes them a little bit more to recognize feeders as a food source. But what seems to happen is that one or a few birds will learn to use a feeder locally. And once that happens, then many other crossbills, again, the social information, super important to crossbills, attracts them, and it kind of spreads locally through the population, through learning. And so we see that happen kind of locally. So I wouldn't say that feeders are super important sources of food for crossbills, but they will use them. And if you want to attract crossbills to a feeder, sunflower seeds are the best way to do that.
This might be a good one for Chloe then too. It's not exactly a crossbill question, but how can we support our songbirds? Chloe said, I feed mine, but sometimes wonder if it's worse for them to rely on my food supply. So a little off the crossbill for a second, but
yeah, sure. It's partially that answer is a little bit complicated. So my personal opinion, and probably there is some opinion in this, is that feeding birds is a good thing, so long as we're feeding them, healthy items, food items, and taking care of the feeders. So you may have heard in the news this year that pine siskins, which is a relative of crossbills that we study in our lab too, they've had a pretty high mortality due to salmonella problems. And that spreads worse at feeders because the birds cluster there. When they sit on the feeder, they might poop, and that then, of course, spreads the bacteria. and infects other birds. And so they actually were recommending this year that you take down your feeders. It's been such a problem. And it's even in a few cases been documented spread to humans who didn't realize that that could happen, and that you should wash your hands after you handle the feeder. So anyway, there are times when I think feeders can be problematic, but in general, I support them. Birds are declining kind of across the board. And I think anything that we can do, even if it's supporting, our urban species that come to feeders, I'm supportive of that.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to go ahead and chat a bunch of links that I looked up prior to this that are for citizen science projects, because that was one of the pre-questions that we had. So hopefully they all work. If not, you can copy and paste it maybe and do it later. But a couple of the last two of them have links to more that were on like the Audubon's Society page, where eBird had one of all these options as well. But things that you can do besides just feeding, but citizen science.
Jalen, I think we just have a couple minutes left. So what other pre-registration questions we should cover?
Let's see. There were a couple, but I don't know if they were explicit to crossbills. So there's one that does a given songbird sing the same song over and over, or does it sing a range of songs?
So that depends on the species, and some birds are capable of mimicking, and they're what are called open-ended learners. They can learn a new song throughout their whole life, and so they might add elements and change it to be sexier and to attract more females or different females. And then you have other species that are much more constrained, and they're constrained to what's called a sensitive period during development, when they can hear the songs that are around them, most often their father, singing, and then they practice, and there's a point in their life quite young when that song, it's called, crystallizes, and that's the song they'll then sing for their whole life. So there's variation in that. And actually, we know a lot about human language acquisition by studying bird song learning in songbirds. They've been a really important model for that.
I'm going to hold one of these questions for a second, but I want to ask the one here that's, how have there been any changes in migration routes due to climate change? And I also think that kind of goes with the last question we have live here, which is how generalizable, how or relatable are crossbills to other songbirds and the unpredictability of climate change?
Yeah, so I'll start with the crossbill question, I guess. They are specialists, and so in that sense, they're unique, and we study them in part because they are unique, because they can breed in winter, which is such an incredible feat for a tiny bird with a really high metabolic rate to be able to produce young in these super cold, we're talking like -10 degrees in the winter. And yet they can do this, and that is amazing. But at the same time, they're also beholden to all the other, forces of nature that all the other species are. And, the physiology is going to be very similar. And so they have a lot of the shared, strategies to them that all the other species have. And so I think that they are quite generalizable to other species. The main difference being that they have this specialized morphology that allows them to have higher food intake. And so they can do these special things. And we can measure that and try to understand more about it. Are we?
Yeah.
We have time?
Yeah, I think so. So thank you for everybody that had questions, and sorry for those that we didn't get to. If you do still have these questions, feel free to email me or Jamie after today, and we can answer any questions that you had about this talk. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming, and we're going to send it back to Marlis to close everybody out. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for your questions, and big thanks to Jamie and to Jalen. I learned so much today and have a new appreciation for your favorite species, the crossbill. To everyone who joined us today, I want to let you know that a recording of the webcast will be posted on the OSU Foundation Events webpage. And we will also include the link in an email so you can share the talk with any of your friends who weren't able to join us today. The email will also include information on some upcoming events, and one that's happening next week is Leave It to Beavers, Nature's Engineers. So you may know your Oregon State beaver, but how well do you know Oregon's official state animal? In this webcast, you'll get better acquainted with the North American beaver, which is also featured in a current exhibit at the High Desert Museum in Bend. This talk will be on Wednesday, April 28th, presented in conjunction with Damn Proud Day. The next Knowledge Breaks webcast will be a hardcore seafloor tour, and we're offering a tour of OSU's Marine and Geology Repository, which holds tens of thousands of sediment cores from the world's oceans. Each of these cores provides clues about our planet's history. So join us for this journey back in time on June 3rd. And later this summer, perhaps of interest to anyone who has a furry family member, will be a talk on the quality of life for pets, treating cancer, one dog, one cat at a time. We'll go behind the scenes at the Lois Bates Atchison Veterinary Hospital with OSU oncologists, learning how they diagnose and treat animals with cancer on July 14th. Thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope you'll be able to join us again soon. Please enjoy your evening. Thanks.